Welcome to the LSI Behind the Wind podcast. My name's Sean Slatter, and for 30 years I've dedicated my life to the science of business development. I've seen the impact of our work, which has evolved into economic development and now social impact. And today I am so excited. I have a longtime friend joining me today, Steve Peterson. Steve is one of the most talented policy strategists and has such a deep understanding of the Department of Defense, appropriations, defense communities. Steve has worked 30 years in the Congress, and he has served in leadership roles on committees and within a lot of the different legislative and community organizations. And I worked closely with Steve for over 30 years now. And just, Steve, appreciate you being with me. And just start out, talk about a little bit of your background and history and how did you get to the Congress?
Well, thanks, Sean. I appreciate you inviting me on. Yeah, we go back a long time. I can't believe how time has passed. 31 and a half years of congressional work. And I retired this past January.
Congratulations.
From congressional staff. But yeah, how I found myself back in Washington is really interesting. From the time I was a little boy, I was always, for lack of a better term, a political animal. I was kind of a weird kid. I had three older brothers, and my mom and dad, we were always busy on the family farm, raising crops, doing things. And from the time I was a little kid, I was fascinated by the news, fascinated by Congress, government, and came at it more or less from the sense of what does government do and what can they do to us? I remember a talk of, just different taxes and things, my dad grousing about, impacts on farmers. And I was just always interested in that. So in fact, just if I bore you with a little story,
Yeah.
Back in, I believe it was 1972, I would have been 9 years old. I was down on the tractor. So when you grow up on a farm in northern Utah, at least when I was there, it probably violates some federal child labor laws. But I did a lot of tractor work for my dad. And I had a little radio. He was a great dad, and he kept us with radios and Pepsi Cola and all kinds of stuff to keep us going. And I heard on the radio that there was going to be a press conference from President Nixon to announce wage and price controls. And I thought, what? The president can control a person's wages? And I thought, that's not right. He's not an emperor. And I got off on the tractor and I went up to the house. I went in the living room, turned on the old TV, it was with the tubes and they warmed up and everything. There was Walter Cronkite, CBS News, and I watched that whole press conference. And, I was 9 years old. And so in junior high, I subscribed to U.S. News and World Report. That may not mean a lot to a lot of people listening, but back in the day, that was like one of the preeminent weekly news magazines. And so I saved up my pop bottles and cashed them in, and I got a subscription. And, so I was always interested in that. I was in high school debate. I've always just been interested in going to law school, learning about the law, and I really love debate. So little by little, I went to Utah State for undergrad, and there was an internship program there, and I just was dying to participate. And so I ended up being an intern for Congressman Jim Hansen, the 1st District of Utah. And he had me come back in 1985, January of 1985. And so I was there for 3 months doing the internship. And then they asked me to stay on staff for an additional 6 months, at which time I told them, I love it here. I want to come back someday, but I've got to go and finish my undergrad degree. And they were understanding, so I did. But I'll tell you, from the minute I got in Washington and I was just in awe when I saw the Capitol. I just thought, what is a farm boy from northern Utah doing back here? But I was just thrilled and excited to be there. And I was just anxious to learn everything about the whole process. And and what's going on. There's always something fascinating going on. And to this day, there still is. It's when you work up there, it kind of spoils you for, there's just always something going on in the background or in the forefront. And then it was also neat to see, like, Utahns coming back, like you would come back. They would come visit us in the office. They would educate us on issues. They would bring us all kinds of interesting facts and give us some experiences and learning experiences. And it really was like an on-the-job education. And I kind of got squirreled into doing, military stuff at first. I thought, that really isn't my background. And Congressman Hansen said, well, I really value that position, and you've got what it takes, and I really want you to do that. And so at the time I was going to law school at night. When I came back from my undergrad in 1990s, when I started again on the Hill, and as a staffer this time. So I was doing law school at Georgetown at night. I don't recommend it. So I always tell people I'm a recovering lawyer, but the education was valuable to me, and particularly with working on legislative provisions and stuff, it really helped me understand some basic things about constitutional law, about separation of powers, about how to draft laws, just writing. Being an intern on Capitol Hill for the office that I was with Jim Hansen was probably the best thing I could ever have done to prepare for law school, because you're thrown right into the mix and instantly you're answering phone calls and letters. So you have to research the issue. You have to present a balanced response in a draft form to the congressman so he can sign off on it. So that it requires you to dig, and you have to write well. So I was constantly practicing how to improve my writing, which if you go to law school, it's all thinking and writing.
Right.
And so it was a great experience. And
so let me reminisce for a minute. You struck a chord with me on some of the things that you said. I had a similar experience the first time I went to Washington, D.C. I'd only been on a plane one other time, which was just the year before. In 1992, I remember this so vividly. So this was 30 years ago now. And I flew into BWI, and I drove down. I landed in Baltimore in the afternoon, and I remember it was winter time. It was cold, and I was driving down from Baltimore, and you've done this a number of times, and as the sun was going down, when I saw the Capitol for the first time, I had that same just emotional, I couldn't believe I was there. And I remember later that night, I checked into my hotel, and I walked around the mall, and I walked up to the Lincoln Memorial, and it was so really spiritual for me in a lot of ways. I can remember I just started tearing up, and it was this incredible experience to be there. And I don't know, there's something about that, experiencing that for the first time. It's overwhelming, isn't it?
it is overwhelming, and it never gets old.
It never gets old. You're right.
It never gets old. It's I've worked up there through 6 presidents, 6 administrations, and they each have their own different emphasis and kind of culture. But Washington, the architecture, the importance of it as the center of democracy for the entire world is it truly is a beacon on the hill if we can keep it, and that's always the challenge.
There's something about it that is just going there and experiencing that, especially at that time in your life. And I was hooked. I wanted to do something meaningful, and like you, and I saw that this path that I was on was probably the right path for me to pursue some of these things I was interested in, and in economics and business development. And so it's been interesting. So you and I met, we didn't meet on that trip, but I met you shortly after that because LSI was working BRAC, working the 93 BRAC. So I started going to Washington, D.C. every month beginning in 1992, so 30 years ago this year. And a lot of our focus, especially at that time, was the 1993 base realignment and closure, which was significant in a lot of ways. Now, you had worked a couple of other BRACs previously, if I remember right. I think you worked 88 and 91 BRAC. So you were well seasoned by by this time.
Yes.
Right? I mean, maybe talk about, you said that you got thrown into this committee work with working for Jim Hansen, and then shortly after you started, I'm guessing you were focused on the 1988 base realignment and closure, right?
That's correct. So I started in earnest again in 1990. So
Okay.
the 1988 BRAC will have already have happened. But I had to pick up the pieces and start working some of that in conjunction with Senator Garn's staff. Jackie Clegg Dodd and I worked together on some of those things for Fort Douglas. Some of the early land transfers and that affecting Fort Douglas and the cemetery and everything up there. So we like to say it was probably some of the lowest hanging fruit on BRAC for Utah. You know, we love Fort Douglas, the historic nature of it, the architecture, everything is wonderful. But, you know, it fit the criteria for BRAC. I mean, it was underutilized, it's expensive to maintain, and the university needed expansion areas. So it all worked together. And so it actually was a fun thing to work on. It wasn't like people calling you saying, oh, I'm going to be out of a job, which came later. So that BRAC was a more or less a piece of cake.
So, Steve, in 1988, I mean, a lot of your focus, obviously, early on was Air Force related, and you got into some of the other organizations over time. But I mean, obviously, Hill was a big focus. It was in the district. You did work some, I'm guessing, work at Dugway, Tooele, Fort Douglas, as soon as you came in. But do you remember, as you started, the chemistry at that time where AFLC had just been reorganized into AFMC, and it was really in tandem with that BRAC too. So it wasn't just the base closures, but there was a real reorganization within DoD, right?
Yes. The services took advantage of the need to downsize from the Cold War infrastructure and to reshape themselves, because they haven't been able to do that for decades since the end of the Second World War. And a lot of that has to do with the whole reason we had a BRAC law in the beginning, is because the military did have a legitimate need to downsize in areas, to consolidate, to, like any big enterprise, it would need to do that to maintain relevancy. But Congress, and this is where I got an education about the appropriations process, is that any well-positioned member of Congress, particularly in leadership or on the appropriations committee, can, in the past, could run interference with closing base in my state or my district, because it meant jobs at home.
Right.
And, I came to respect that point of view that, well, the people at home elected you to represent them and their interests. But, at some point, the national interest has to come and weigh in there. And so Congress developed the base closing law, and that was a product of Representative Dick Armey from Texas. And it was painful to see it take shape, because we knew that it wouldn't be pretty down the road as things got harder, depending on how much the defense budget was going to be cut, how much downsizing they needed to make. And at the time BRAC passed, it was George H.W. Bush. So there was a projection about that. And it's like, well, we could handle that. And then Bill Clinton was elected,
Right.
and he campaigned on the idea that of a 30% reduction in defense. In reality, it was closer to a 50% reduction.
It was.
So that really resulted in the need to, this is my opinion, but looking at it, I think that maybe we cut a little bit too aggressive in some of those rounds, because the idea is, okay, you get infrastructure is hard to maintain, buildings deteriorate, they need constant maintenance. I get that. But there's some of this land, and more importantly, the airspace above it, or the docking areas, the deep water ports, that once the military gives those things up, they're gone forever.
That's right.
Development takes over, and you'd have to come back later and condemn billions of dollars worth of property. And it's with all of the politics involved. So I think there was a lot of us that began to be concerned about the process and from the 85 round, that it was kind of too aggressive, but part of that was driven by the budget cuts of the Clinton era. So
there was, we've sort of forgotten this, but for a decade, really the first decade of your career, the majority of your focus, I would guess, was BRAC, right?
BRAC consumed, I would dare say, at least half, if not 2/3 of my time, particularly in the years when the commission was active and there was a decision to be made.
That's
and
right.
then the years prior, you kind of gear up for that, right? With the community, with the community support groups, and working with the base commanders, and with LSI. LSI did a lot of economic studies.
We did.
Did a great job putting these studies together to show impact, but also some what ifs. What if we did this? What would the impact, what would the benefit be? And that's where LSI has always been ideally situated, in my opinion, going back decades. I don't know anybody that can touch what LSI has done as far as doing those things.
That's so kind of you to say that. And that's really where we started working together. The LSI leadership had seen what had happened in those previous BRACs and had been very involved, with the Industrial Associates, which was really the precursor to what became the Utah Defense Alliance. But early on, it was just a group of community leaders really coming together to say, we're concerned about national security issues, we're concerned about our community and the impact that these installations have within our community. And I'll tell you another, I don't know why, I think just connecting with you has made me so reminiscent and sentimental. But when I first joined LSI, we had a ritual that every Friday at about 3 o'clock, somebody went to Hill Air Force Base and went to the officers club, went to the base club, and saved tables at the club. And every Friday night between 4 and 6:30, all of the base leadership would come in there, and we would talk about these kinds of things in the club. And that went on for a lot of years. That was a ritual. It was mandatory. Everybody was up there. It was mandatory from the base side too, that the installation leadership, the civilians and military, did 2 hours at least at the club, and we talked about these kinds of things. We also, LSI at the time, prior to me joining the company, had established the Industrial Associates that was connected to the Air Force Association and continued on even after the formation of the Utah Defense Alliance. which became the entity that you really, this was really your vision, Steve. I mean, I remember you saying, I was in a meeting with you, and I remember you saying, listen, we really need an organization like other communities have that can do this kind of work, the policy work, the analysis, and we need an entity to put this together. This was your idea, which I thought was brilliant. And what was this loose, we're going to get together on a Friday night, or we're going to get together once a month and talk about national security issues, installation issues, became the Utah Defense Alliance. Maybe talk about that for a minute.
Absolutely. It's some of my best memories looking back of the BRAC era was getting these good Americans like you talked about. And they really, like you, the cream of the crop, the leaders in the local community who were concerned about BRAC and what it might do to the economics of northern Utah. But more importantly, they were concerned about the big picture. What's this going to do to our military? And they were, without exception, a whole group of them willing to sacrifice a lot of their personal time to devote to an effort that would complement the delegation's efforts on representing Utah's interests before BRAC. And so we formed a group called the Hill DDO 95 was the name
Right.
they picked. And the editor of the Ogden Standard Examiner, Sheldon, I can't remember his last name now. I'm getting older in years. My memory slips me. Anyway, he volunteered his legal work to form a 501c3.
Right.
And that allowed for the organization to do some fundraising within the community with corporations. And that money was deemed essential to be able to help mount a defense. And when I say defense on BRAC, we want to defend jobs where they should be defended. But it was also a proactive effort if we see an opportunity to pursue that in a productive sort of way. So I think from the beginning, Utah had a kind of a different mindset from a lot of other states. It's like, you're not going to move one job from my state, and I'm going to fight you tooth and nail. And our attitude, I think for the whole delegation was, we're going to defend our jobs, but we're defending them because we know that on military value, we rank the highest if you look at the criteria. And so naturally, we want to be defensive of that. But if we didn't merit staying open, we would say, okay, we've got to move these jobs, but here's something else we can do to replace it, or we can bring something else from somewhere. And so this organization, Hill DDO 95, was head up by General Mike Pavich. At the time, he was a 2-star general. He had commanded McClellan Air Force Base in California, Sacramento Air Logistics Center. So it was a real coup to get Mike. And those of you who know Mike, he is a fantastic person, just a great American, and he's a native Utahn. Yeah. And so he'd retired to Utah, and then so we were able to just scoop him up, and then he volunteered so much of his time. And around his leadership effort, so many other people that I could name, but there's a whole laundry list, all jumped in. And to this day, there's still a significant amount of those members that are still volunteering with this now called Utah Defense Alliance. So after BRAC 95, there was a decision to change the name to make sure that people understand that, BRAC 95 is passed, but it has a continuing role as an organization to foster the military interests of Utah, but also of the nation. So, and they've been very productive, in my estimation, for a lot of issues. But you're right. I mean, at the time, Congressman Hansen, who was my boss, was the only Utah federal representative on a defense committee. So he was on the House Armed Services Committee. And so that's the position on his staff, his personal staff, that I worked with the House Armed Services Committee staff for many, many years. So I worked for Jim Hansen for 18 years. And of that time, I think I worked 13 of them on the Armed Services Committee stuff. So, and the other 5, I was out in Utah as his district director. And I continue to work with the committee, although from the district and his DC staff.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, it's the 95 round was very stressful for Utah. The 93 round of BRAC, became a little more painful because Tooele Army Depot was on
Yes.
the list for major downsizing. And at the time, we had successfully persuaded the Army to build something called the Consolidated Maintenance Facility at Tooele. At the time, the Army had a maintenance or a depot structure at Tooele. It was a major depot activity for the Army, and it did all the ground vehicles for the Army and many of them for the United States Marines. And so they modernized the facility just in time for BRAC 93 to roll around. And I remember being at the ribbon cutting in 1993 out in Tooele. And there's a long story. I won't go into it, but the funding was on again, off again. Red River, Texas wanted it really bad.
Right.
And so there was kind of behind the scenes trying to get to Dick Cheney to freeze the funding or unfreeze the funding for Utah. In the end, it was unfrozen. Jim Hansen personally lobbied Dick Cheney, who unfroze it. And we finished this wonderful facility. Amazing. It was cutting edge. You know, and you could roll a truck in one end of the building, and about 3 days later, it'd roll out the other side of the facility. It would have been completely taken apart, refurbished, the engines, the transmission, the brakes, the body, everything completely redone. It's like it's a new truck. And very few hands would have ever touched it. It was all computerized, modernized, and such a far cry from World War II era, you know, mechanical stuff. So we thought, yeah, we're in a great position at Tooele to stay open, right? Because we're the most modern. I should have known the bad omen on the ribbon cutting. Were you? I don't know if you were there, Sean.
I was. I do.
You remember that?
I was there. Yes.
And there was this untimely snowstorm and squall that moved through, and it tore the bunting off the stage for the band that was going to play, you know, the ceremonial band. Everybody was getting pelleted with snow and hail, and were running for the building. And and I thought, this is not a good sign on our ribbon cutting.
No. And for those of you that don't know the Utah geography, a lot of people think about Utah as this amazing, they think about the Wasatch and the amazing skiing, or they think about the national parks in southern Utah. In the West Desert, there's a part of the state that has its own unique beauty, right? And it is flat as can be, and there is nothing out there. And those storms come over that, come from the west to east, and that was a crazy day.
It was a crazy day. We had the Secretary of the Army was there.
That's right.
Himself, and you know, a lot of dignitaries, and it was so yeah, that was an inauspicious beginning, but
just unraveled from there.
It did. It was like 3 months later. So in January, the process began, and then the Army unrolled its recommendations, and Tooele Army Depot, this consolidated maintenance facility, was put on the chopping block. And we just could not believe it, because the facilities that the Army kept in that round were not modernized. So the economics behind that decision was something that we aggressively challenged. But in the end, they said, well, we have to, the commission decided, well, we've got to close some bases. So we're sorry, but the community can pick up this facility and hopefully redevelop it, which is what's happened. It's kind of too bad the military invested in it for military purposes, but you know, industry was able to get a hold of it and turn it to the benefit of the state and the community. And so that was and that's something that we were involved with as well after BRAC.
That's right.
It wasn't we just, okay, BRAC's over, we're done. It's like we continued to work it with the Department of Defense. At the time, it's called the Office of Economic Adjustment.
Right.
They've changed the name now to Defense Community Cooperation. But I
can't believe you can remember. I cannot do it.
Oh, it's emblazoned in my mind. But anytime we could tap into federal money for our state and local, I was all for it.
Absolutely.
And, so we felt really good about what happened out at Tooele. There were some people that called. I remember some investors were going to build the Walmart building out in Tooele just as the BRAC came down. And I remember them calling me, like, I guess they felt I was the only one that could really know what was going to happen with BRAC. And I just said, I don't know. No, none of us know. But in the end, if it does happen, are people still going to move to Tooele? Are they still going to commute to Salt Lake? Yeah, they're still going to go shop at Walmart. So it turned out to be a good investment on their part, I think, because it's boomed out there ever since the closure. But
So, what I think's interesting about this discussion is a lot of what LSI has been doing in the last decade has been economic development and the social impact work. But the genesis of this really started even before I had joined the company, around that 1986, 87 timeframe when LSI was working on an overall Air Force strategy, but AFLC, the LSI worked the AFLC strategy in 1988, worked all of the depot consolidation, and then BRAC in later in 1988 and 1991. I joined the company in 1992, and we were still, as you said, picking up the pieces from those previous BRACs. Immediately started working the 93 BRAC, and then 95 was really when I was entrenched in this and was coming to DC multiple times a month. Even when we got down to it, you remember you had mentioned, Steve, that you thought that was really a stressful time. I can remember sitting in Jim Hansen's office. I can remember him saying to everybody in there, listen, it's not going to happen. They're going to close Hill, they're going to close Kelly, and they're going to the power that the California delegation has to keep McClellan open is, I can remember him almost resigning to the fact that, yep, it's going to close. And one of the things that later that week, I can remember Jim Hansen making a call and saying, the Utah Test and Training Range is state land. And you remember this? He was saying that is just like you had previously mentioned, this is a national asset. We're going to give this back to the state. I'll make sure that goes back to the state. We're going to make this a state park. Or he had some kind of where everybody's looking at each other going, what is he talking about?
So he on occasion would play hardball. That was a hardball play.
Oh my goodness.
Because,
I was dying over that.
Yeah, because at the time, the Air Force, there were some generals that had worked their way up through the command structure, and ACC generals, Air Combat Command, and Cannon Air Force Base in New Mexico was a single mission base, and it was in the crosshairs on, I think, every round of BRAC. And I feel for the community. I've been to Cannon. I've met those people. They're great people. And all things being equal, we should keep it because the airspace is valuable. But at the time, there was tremendous pressure to downsize. And so it came down to, well, in order to be viable, we have to move the fighter wing, the F-16s from Hill down to Cannon to keep it open and viable. And so effectively what it would do is turn Hill Air Force Base into just a depot operation. They wouldn't have the fighter wing there. And so, what a shame with the Utah Test Range right there, the preeminent range in the lower 48 states. And I know Nellis takes a little exception to that characterization, but it's really true. Hill has, the Utah Test Range has the largest amount of unrestricted airspace from ground level to infinity than any other range in the lower 48. And that's extremely valuable. But, and so we've always thought of the Utah Test Range as the ace in the hole for Utah. And I think that still holds true, is that, you can move depot jobs anywhere where the labor rate is competitive and you have a good, workforce and so forth, and cost of doing business. But you can't move airspace other than where it is.
Right.
And, it's hard to find that anymore. So the delegation over the time I was there, 32 years, united together, Republicans and a couple of the Democrats in our delegation over that time, that would support measures to strengthen and preserve the Utah Test and Training Range. And we ran all of that out of the Hanson office. And then we did a couple of things here, I guess about 10 years ago with Senator Hatch's staff, and I worked together on a couple of expansion ones. But yeah, so that ploy by Hanson was to get their attention, the senior Air Force officials' attention. And I have to say that it worked.
It did.
It was uncomfortable. He didn't like to do it, but it worked. It got their attention. And some of the generals that had engineered that scheme to preserve Cannon, I think, got it handed to them for going around what, the analysis had been. So we kept the fighters.
No question. And this was such a great team effort. I can remember working with all of the delegation, all of the staff, the committee members, and whatever. I just remember it was this team effort, and you would call me and say, go figure this out, and we would. Our whole team would be all dedicated to this. And I can remember you, and I would try to think back, Rowdy Yates, and Bill Johnson, and I mean, some of those guys, Bill Castle.
Castle.
And it was just this choreography of we're working together for the benefit of the community and for the benefit of the country too. I really felt that. And I can remember there would be committee members going into hearings and needed data or needed something, and our team they would have that and send that.
Yeah, it was remarkable.
To the group. And it really, I started at that time, I started to put together this puzzle of the economic piece of this, and also the military value, the military value and the economic value of these installations. And it really, it was so illustrative of the work of LSI even before I had started, and I knew this was going to be my career. I knew that at that time that I was going to spend the rest of my career doing this work. So a side note, I happened to be at McClellan Air Force Base when the BRAC was announced. And you remember, we had heard, it had come out of the Congress that it was going to be announced on this day. And interestingly, I was at McClellan when that was announced. And President Clinton had said, not to worry, we're going to privatize these jobs in place. There's going to be no jobs lost. And McClellan Air Force Base at that time probably had 12,000 or 13,000 people. They went from 12,000 jobs at McClellan to zero. There was nothing that stayed. At one time, Steve, LSI was the largest tenant at McClellan Air Force Base with 30 people there.
Wow. Yeah. That was a tough one, politically, all the air logistics centers at the time, that was what they were called.
Right.
Now they're complexes with the most recent reorg, but they were the largest single employers in the respective states. And when I first started on the Hill, I would like to say there were like 8.
There was.
I can't remember.
You're exactly right. There were 9. There were 9, and that they closed 4 in the previous BRACs down to 5, and then reduced it to 3 in the 95 BRAC.
95 BRAC.
And the strategy from DOD and from the Congress was, let's have, and it made sense, let's have a a West Coast depot, an East Coast depot, and a depot in the middle. That was the thinking, and we came up with some creative ways to overcome that big picture strategy. If you remember,
Yeah.
we were pulling union grievances out of the other depots.
Yes. Yeah.
But I remember Jim Hansen saying, hey, let's decide and let's brace for the fact that we may lose this battle. Especially it would make sense that the West Coast depot would be McClellan, and that with the California delegation, they're not going to allow that to close. And
at the time, Bill Clinton was going through a re-election.
He was.
Those 52 electoral votes are pretty important. And in fact, he was at the base and recorded saying, "I will think of a way around the law."
I was there.
And privatize in place.
And it never happened.
Yeah.
But it was really your strategy, Steve, that putting this together to overcome all of these obstacles, and it was a team effort. I mean, there was a lot of individuals that contributed to the success of the '95 BRAC, which that
came very close to losing.
Very close.
Very close. I think if Utahns knew how close.
Right.
That's where my hair went.
And Steve, at the time, Northern Utah could not have. It would have taken decades for Northern Utah to have bounced back from losing those jobs. It was everything, and still to this day, everything in Northern Utah is so central to Hill Air Force Base. It's still Utah's largest employer. It's so critical and vital to the country's national security and Utah's economy. And I think it's easy for the members of the legislature and the administration to overlook the impact that Hill has on Utah's economy, and it's still the largest employer, largest economic engine in Utah.
Not just Utah; it spills all over into
it does.
5 states.
That's right. One of the other things I want to talk about the 2005 BRAC, because there was some things that happened during that time that I thought was interesting. But in 1995, we were working with a lot of different communities. We really, as I said, it was every 2 years there was another BRAC, or you were either preparing for a BRAC, or how are we going to pick up the pieces from the previous year's BRAC? For 10 years that happened. In 1995, we were hired by the community of Huntsville and a lot of other communities, and we put together these strategies. And looking back now, 20 years later, on the strategy of the Utah strategy, the Huntsville strategy, Oklahoma strategy, which we were working closely with Mary Fallon, and to see how this has come together, to see the strategy, and then now the jobs. I mean, we estimate in Huntsville in the last 20 years, there's been 100,000 new jobs created in Huntsville. And we've got those stories at Hill and in Oklahoma and in Ohio as well. So it's interesting to look back and think about what was the strategy at the time, because oftentimes in your career, you build out a plan that may be decades to implement. We got to see that. We got to see what it looked like now from that strategy, and we learned a lot. And I mean, I think we've got a good methodology. Well, let's talk about the 2005 BRAC. Governor Huntsman had just been elected And we had been working with his organization and even previously, the previous administration. And I was asked, as you may remember, to brief the committee on the economic impact and military value of Hill Air Force Base. And it was one of the greatest honors that I've ever had to go in and really talk about our strategy with the committee and answer all of those questions from the committee on why is Hill Air Force Base relevant? Why is it important? Why do we need Hill Air Force Base in the middle of the Utah desert? And you work closely with me on that, preparing for that testimony, and as well as a lot of other people. But it was really an honor for me to go in and represent our community and deliver that testimony. And I wanted you to know how much I appreciated you coaching me through that. And we had some other people that we Phil Groney and others that really were instrumental in that work. But I think back on that time, Steve, it really was a great time to work with you, and it was amazing. It really was.
Yeah, it was. I look back with great fondness. I mean, I'm not sure I want to go through it again, but just the people like you and the UDA folks, it was really one of the highlights of my career and my life. It really was. They're all good friends. So I was really just impressed by how much people put any egos or self-interest aside and really joined together in team efforts for Utah.
I agree.
I mean, they really did.
Did you have any thoughts or memories of 2005? And I mean, that was a little different approach, a little different strategy than the 95 BRAC.
Well, I do remember the 95 round was, we were upended. It was a surprise.
It was.
That came out in the Washington Post in the, I forget the gossip column, but it leaked out that there was a plan to sacrifice Hill Air Force Base to keep Kelly and McClellan open in California and Texas. And at the time, Air Force Secretary Whit Peters was over in Europe, and he was on his way back from a trip there. And my boss knew Whit Peters. He used to work on the HASC staff, and they were pretty good friends, even though they're opposite parties. And so Jim tracked down how to get a hold of Whit and said, is this true? Is this rumor true? And Whit Peters, I guess he's on a satellite phone or something. He said, no, Congressman, I'm not aware of any sort of reason why that would be true. And Jim said, well, does that represent the official position of the Air Force that you do not support closing Hill Air Force Base? And he said, we stand by the recommendations we sent forward to the Hill. And said, okay, that's great. Can we get that in writing as soon as you land? And so, he agreed to do it, and he did a letter. And then we got that letter out. We faxed it to the whole free world. And what that did is it cut off at the knees this plot. And it was a plot. It was a strategy from some Air Force brass to keep 4 ALCs versus having to go down to 3. And, there's some logic to what they were thinking. That's more budget, that's more capability that we can retain. And, who cares about Utah anyway? They're good people, but they're small politically. They're the weak link, particularly under a Democrat administration. We think we can pull this off. We think we can pull that off with the commission if we just sacrifice Hill, forget what the charts say as far as military value. Hill was always number one on military value. And there's a lot of, as you know, your team did a lot of analysis with that, taking what the Air Force did. And we were always number one. We were always proud at Hill Air Force Base that every time the AFMC commander would come in and every time there was a change of command, They would say, you can't say that we said this, but you are the best base. You are my best
Right.
base. Your workforce is by far the best. You have the lowest absentee rate. Your production rates are so much higher than San Antonio or California. At the end, I think that's what saved us.
I agree. That
But we were
community,
able to smoke out that plot and cut it off. Otherwise,
yeah.
don't know.
So, Steve, you in your career, in the time you spent on the Hill and with the Congress, I mean, you did a lot of other things besides just BRAC. I mean, we've talked about, spent most of the time talking about BRAC, but I look at the workload, the funding, the appropriation, the policy, the environmental issues that you have worked in your career tangent to BRAC and protecting and growing the installation. And I have said for years that there really has been no one that has done so much for an installation as you have for Hill Air Force Base. And even the littlest details, you were never afraid to go do battle for this installation. And I was so appreciative of that. And really, our team has been saying that you've quietly been pulling all of the strings in the background for 30 years that have now created infrastructure and funding to grow the base. I mean, a lot of the work that you did positioned Hill for the F-35 workload, for GBSD workload, for the workload that was inherited from the other depots, the software, the composites workload, and even some of the legacy workload like A10. And I think that you quietly pulled all of the strings to make that happen. And I was excited last year to nominate you for the Big Hat Award. And there's not a lot of people that know about this award, but you cannot believe the amount of celebrities in the annals of DOD that have won this award, and including Admiral Nimitz and Harold Talbot and Jack Dempsey won, and I don't.
Jack Dempsey.
Jack Dempsey. I mean, you are in this class of individuals and well deserved. General DeLuca and General Haben and General Poe. Some of these, General Marquez. Some of these names that I've mentioned are real celebrities. Secretaries of the Air Force, secretaries of defense, the senators and congressmen. And Steve, you so deserve this award. I was just so excited to nominate you and then be there for that ceremony last year. And I wanted to just congratulate you again for that.
I appreciate it very much.
So well deserved, and there is no one that has done that and has had the impact that you've had at Hill Air Force Base. The last thing I wanted to talk to you about was what's going on today with military installations and communities. I feel like it's a similar environment to that early days that you and I started doing this, the 93 era. I see consolidation of organizations. I see obviously a significant shift in budgets and focus. And I'd like for you to talk for a minute just about your assessment overall of what you think's the future. Is there another BRAC? I mean, there's been rumors about this for a few years. The last 2 years, we've heard this mention of BRAC again out of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, the potential for a new BRAC or something very different, something around workload consolidation. We have seen a lot of changes because of COVID where many base organizations are virtual, and do we need installations? I mean, those kinds of questions are going on in the House and the Senate all the time. Do you think, just tell me about your thoughts, and then I'll ask you one final question.
Sure, no problem. I think the idea of BRAC is always in the background, and that I think there's a lot of members that recognize that there needs to be a way to reauthorize a consolidating type of movement between military installations, because there is a lot of shifting over towards virtual. A lot of our warfare now is virtual with UAVs, and
That's right.
you've got Space Command that's got stood up as a entirely new service, and their stuff is online virtually. And so there's that pressure. But at the same time, there has been shrinking amount of budget that's been going into maintaining our military infrastructure. And I don't know the full cause of that. For years I've watched it, and I've been a little concerned, and a lot of people are, that it's just in the budgeting process. It's, operations and maintenance funding and military construction, other than for new programs, is just really very low priority. And that pot of money shrunk to the point where some of the bases are just not keeping up. And so there's too many buildings, too many things to maintain, that if they're not being used, maybe we need to figure out another solution. We're a fan in Utah, at least I am, of enhanced use lease
Absolutely.
Opportunities with Falcon Hill. There are people that are familiar that ought to look it up, Google it, Falcon Hill at Hill Air Force Base. And that's a win-win all the way around. It benefits the military, it benefits the community by using underutilized federal land, privatizing it for a period of time, and then allow commercial benefit and that income stream to benefit directly the military construction program of the base. And so I think Hill was the first really big one. And to this date, I think it's probably the most successful as well. And I was happy to be a part of that. It wasn't my original idea, but I was glad to help be a part of a team that facilitated the legislation. We had to kind of knock heads a little bit over in the building to get some of the fiefdoms to agree that this novel new approach is worthwhile. And because there's a tendency on the part of bureaucracies to protect their turf and to protect themselves from any sticking their neck out too far on something new. But we prevailed, and I'm very happy about that. So I think that's a wave of the future, is privatization opportunities.
Agreed.
But I think there's a lot of members of the committee that understand that we need to retain airspace, deep ports, and some basic real estate to allow for the future, because we don't know what the future is going to be. But with that said, are there buildings that can be turned over, or portions of the base that can be slimmed down? I think that there will be a BRAC in the future. When? Who knows? But I would think in the next 5 to 10 years, certainly. And I think I would actually advocate for it, because I think that we need to allow the military to modernize and to consolidate where needed, and not just keep things open because of politics. My first boss, Jim Hansen, said, I'd be the first to say, and I believe him, that if we didn't merit staying open, I would tell folks, sorry, we've got to make a lemonade out of a lemon. Let's see how we can do it. Not everybody's that way, but I really think most people are. So I think that there will be a BRAC, and it will be necessary.
Last year, there was 1 million civilian and military members that transitioned to a virtual environment. And initially, everybody thought, no, there's no way we're going to be able to do this. We're not going to be able to do the things we need to do. Nearly 2 years later, a lot of those individuals are still virtual. And so like the military, like a lot of companies, are saying, okay, do we need to have installations and an office and on site for everyone? And they're thinking differently. The budgets are different, and so I think you're right. I think there's going to be a lot of focus on consolidation, modernization, and I sense that. I can feel that it's a similar time to that time in 1993 when the Cold War was over. We're gonna shut down every installation, and so I look forward to working with you in some of these future opportunities to serve communities that where a military installation is such an important part of the community's economic engine and culture, and there's a lot of them out there. And so, and we, as you know, we've worked with a lot of communities. We've done a lot of great work, and I look forward to working with you again on some of these projects, Steve.
Likewise, thank you.
Anything else what have you been doing since retirement, and that's fun? What have you been? I mean, it was a tough time for you to retire because it was in the middle of COVID. But have you done anything fun since you've left the Hill?
Well, not on my scale of fun that I would like to do because of COVID. I like to travel a lot. My wife and I like to travel a lot, and we haven't been able to do that mainly because of COVID. But I've hunkered down. I'm trying to transition into doing some consulting work, and have a couple of partners that trying to help me get started in that business. And
Good.
So far, so good. We've got a handful of clients that I've been helping and find the work very interesting. And so I'm able to leverage my experience into doing this next thing in the private sector, which I am really grateful for. So.
Well, you've got so much history, and I can attest to your policy strategy, and you've just got this mind to put together from beginning to end. You can visualize this is what we're going to do and how we're going to do it, and I've seen that for 30 years. And so anybody listening, hire Steve. This guy is amazing. He is good.
Thank you, Sean.
And I think there's an opportunity for us to work together again as well. Steve, thanks so much for doing this.
Sure.
You have been such an important part of our history, and I felt like even though you were in the Congress all of those years, I felt like you've been a member of our team because of how closely we've worked together and collaborated on these projects. So I've just
the feeling's mutual. You're good friends and top-notch people. And Josh Johnson, who's in your senior team, he's a great guy. I worked side by side with him on congressional staff for a while.
For years.
And think the world of him. He's very capable. And so you're all good people. And I honor this association I have with you.
Thanks, Steve. This has been fun. Take care.
All right. You too. Thank you.
See ya.